So Istanbul started as a kind of collective of friends, really, that had an interest in coming together to make a single project where we were able to be involved in all aspects of making a building project, from the conception, design, the bits that we were familiar with from learning about those processes in university, but also then taking on responsibility for things that architects traditionally aren't. So construction, but also getting the money together and the finance, and then also kind of managing the project, once you've completed it, which is typically the part where you stop really having an involvement and an understanding about how the design you've made, kind of supports or enables certain kinds of use or whatever. So that was the intention, and then over the first few years, that led to doing quite a varied range of work, from architectural projects that are more traditional in terms of the role that we have, but also setting up organisations where architecture was a kind of part, or design was a part, but also the kind of organisational agenda and kind of structure and kind of fundraising and kind of management of spaces like playgrounds or workshops were kind of as important or more important, really, than specific design decisions. So and over time, the format's changed a bit. We're now, I think, around 18 partners, including Mark, who joined practice as our first employee 5 years ago. So we have a structure now where if you're with the practice for 2 years, you become a partner, and that's the way the organisation is kind of developing.
Yeah, I mean, we're excited to have been asked to be part of your guys' program, and of course, at the office we build a lot of things. The workspace that we work within kind of allows us to build quite large models for our projects, and we're very interested in making things at one-to-one to really understand how they sort of fit together, but also as a way to convince other people that it works as a methodology, or the technology works. So it will be really fun, I think, to see what you guys come up with and the students' work, and hopefully be part of that process. I think it's a very interesting theme to explore, and it sort of ties in quite well with the scale that you guys are working with, the kind of pavilion scale, being able to actually, be hands-on in making stuff and figuring out how things are put together in a way that they could, be dismantled or taken apart and reused as someplace else or as something else entirely. I don't know, I think I would encourage the students to maybe think more than just the kind of detail level of exactly how these things are fit together in a way that you can take them apart, but go beyond that and think about the kind of scale of the actual materials that you're using to build these things and their life after the building process. So, the kind of, how can you ensure or try your best to ensure kind of longevity in the construction itself, not just in the way that you detail it coming together, if that makes sense. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have so much experience as a practice in kind of deconstruction, but I think if it's the kind of building scale equivalent of recycling, which is obviously something that has become much more accepted, and there's a much better infrastructure around enabling, but it's still very problematic because it's not getting around the fact that we need to be less wasteful to begin with, and I think the primary thing that we can do alongside designing things to enable them to be reused in the future is to make buildings and change the building culture also. to be more interested in how spaces are appropriated and reused. I think that's what part of this project has been about. So our interest as a practice is probably more in how we make use of what's already there and places that we find. And that's been something which has been consistent in, from the very early projects when we sort of took over a derelict petrol station or something. That actually often things have already like quite strong and specific characteristics that, the most efficient thing to do is to try to work with what's already there. And that applies, I think, in a social context as much as it does in a material one. But I think, whilst we don't, as a practice, have so much experience in terms of like the kind of surveying, analysing, deconstructing, and reconstructing buildings, it's amazing how quickly that whole kind of field feels like it's growing from something that 5 years ago, I was aware of like one company in Norway doing it, whereas now it feels like it's really becoming a part of the way that every like bid is written, with these kinds of considerations in. So, yeah.
I mean, it's like an essential part of the building process. I mean, you're not really going to fully understand how something comes together in its entirety without like having a go at building it one-to-one when it comes to like the sort of detail level of what you're dealing with. I think specifically, or if you're working with sort of new materials or experimental materials as well, there's an element of having to kind of prove that things work. So convincing other people that it works, and I think building it at one-to-one is kind of definitive, or can be sort of definitive proof of like, hey, this is a functioning thing. But,
yeah, I mean, I think exactly as you're saying, really, like I think there's two things. So one is that in education, like a lot of the time, when you're trained as an architect, you don't know how to build stuff. There's a big difference between, understanding like the weight of, a beam, or how different materials require, different kinds of fixings, or what you're going to need, how to do things neatly or how to do things roughly. Until you make something yourself, I don't think you have the knowledge to be able to clearly instruct through drawing, with an understanding of how much you're really asking of somebody, or what the cost associated is, or whether it's a good use of that specific material. All of those things are very embodied. It's kind of embodied knowledge that you acquire through practice, and that mock-ups are a way of practicing that knowledge, so you can apply more accurate, intuitive thinking in drawings. And then there's a role in industry, I think, because if you distinguish between the mock-up and the prototype, like mock-ups are just a thing. Everybody makes mock-ups. That's not something that's special or original. But prototyping as a process is very common in lots of industries, but not so much in design and architecture. So like, leaving aside the scale, like we like to make big models like this one, because I think we find it really useful as a design tool. And when you get to the point often where you're then mocking something up that hasn't been done before, it's a bit experimental in terms of the technology or the materials, you need to reassure people in the building process that the risk is manageable, because everybody's trying to avoid risk, and when things go wrong there's extra costs, and then people start suing each other. So the thing itself, from like a process of prototyping through models and then ultimately a mock-up, is a way of enabling everybody to share the risk, I think. But I think they play a really important part both in education and practice in terms of like doing design better and more intuitively and more intelligently. And yeah, too often in a way, like things are, it's more about integration and compatibility through like BIM software and these kinds of things. And I think it's a very different kind of knowledge in a way. I just think you've got to figure out what you enjoy, and also often persevere with things that you don't at first. But it's not always easy. I think everybody designs in different ways, and it took me like over quite a long time, I think, to figure out what I found a good method and process. But I found architecture school as an experience where you're primarily making decisions as an individual very difficult, and that there was a lot of value once you learn to let go of your own ideas a little bit and be a bit more open to the role that you might have, and to be able to stress less about whether you're like able to do all of these things in a very difficult and expansive profession, and just focus on the things you are good at and what that can contribute to a more kind of collective environment. I think that can be really hard to sort of negotiate at first, but really, it's like that's the environment I've spent the last 12 years working in as a result, and it's been good mostly, very enjoyable.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I would say that to use the sort of assignments that you get at school as like try to use your own interests as a sort of departure point a lot of the time to help you, discover what you're sort of passionate about and like work on those things, but then also not like James said, not being afraid of a bit of hard work and pursuing things that you might not enjoy so much at first, because then you might find that, I think that probably happened to me in certain aspects. You might find that you love it.
I think it often, when you start a project, like there's a lot of requirements, like a building needs to have this many things in, and it needs to sort of serve these functions, and there are lots of different ambitions overlaid from clients or potential end users, and that often that can mean that you think about buildings as really functional things. Like the main thing is to fulfill this set of functions that we start and are really clear and are on the table. And then you also have a budget, so there's like a function of the process needs to be that you bring the building in on budget. And it can sometimes be easy to sort of allow your role as an architect to become about organising those functions and just making sure you're doing a good job on the terms in which everybody else is putting their constraints forward. Where actually I think the best work comes when you're able to step back and say, we can meet those things, but our role is also something more than just engineering a space that is functional but is also special. Like, this is not a good workspace because it meets the needs that the atelier have for the practical requirements of their tasks. It's also that it somehow has something extra in terms of like a generosity of certain types of spaces within the building that maybe make it a bit more social, and there are kind of intangible things maybe that come from that in terms of the way that people work in it becoming better or more cooperative over time. But I don't know, time will be the judge of that. But I think trying to make, so many buildings are made that don't have architects involved, and there are also many buildings that are made that have architects involved, but they're working in such constrained situations that often the outcome is something that's totally purely practical. And I think, in a way, a priority is always just to make sure that there's a clear, strong idea at the start, and that you don't allow that to be lost in the face of all of the practical constraints that projects necessarily have. And that at the end you're able to judge it for like the extent to which that original idea and intent has been preserved and kind of comes through, because then you have a strong building, a good building, a building that was worth all the time and energy and effort and material and money to build it, and not just let it become a question of fulfilling a kind of set of practical requirements with, which it's easy to do because it's incredibly complex in energy and time consuming to make buildings. It requires lots and lots of different people's perspectives, and so I think trying to sort of be clear about what our role is in the process and not allow that to become purely about organising all the different constraints, but also about making new opportunities, I think is really important.
yeah, thank you for inviting us, and we look forward to working together on the projects, and really excited to see what everyone comes up with.
Yeah, I think it sounds really exciting, and yeah, I think don't forget to enjoy what you're doing. Find ways of working which you enjoy, and I think that's often the scenarios in which the best stuff gets done. So yeah, looking forward to it.